Hi there, everybody. So today we're going to get into chapter 12. Throughout the majority of the semester, we talked about bacteria and archaea. We've talked about viruses to some extent, but we haven't talked a lot about the microorganisms and the eukaryotic domain. And so that's what chapter 12 really focuses on. We're going to be focusing on three groups of microorganisms: algae, fungi, and protozoas. Each of these organisms is or can be microscopic, and they're all important. And so they're studied under the microbiology header. We also tend to look at helminths, which are the worms. Though they are macroscopic, the eggs and often the larval forms are very, very small, microscopic. So we tend to study worms or helminthic organisms in microbiology as well. And we'll end with insects. And so I say insects, I should have put arthropods because not everything that we're going to talk about are insects. We will also look at ticks and mites. And we look at these organisms mainly because they are one of the world's best vectors of a lot of the pathogens that we study in microbiology. They also are macroscopic, though. So what makes a eukaryote and a prokaryote different? Hopefully you know this by now. For sure, by the end of the exam or by the end of the year, you will know this because you have to know this for the final exam. Eukaryotes contain a membrane-bound nucleus. They have organelles. They tend to be larger. They tend to be more complex. They can be multicellular. They can go through both sexual and asexual reproduction depending on the organisms. Prokaryotic organisms are always unicellular, though they can survive or live in multicellular arrangements like plaques. They're still single-celled organisms. They go through asexual reproduction, and they don't have organelles. They do have ribosomes. So we have some characteristics alike as well in these organisms. So with the eukaryotic organisms, they can divide asexually via a process known as mitosis, where you divide the nucleus and then the cell divides. Or we can go through asexual reproduction via meiosis, where we take a diploid cell and produce haploid sex cells from them. The haploid cells can develop into organisms of their own, depending on the type of eukaryote that you're looking at, or the haploid sex cells can bond together. So you have two haploid sex cells from different organisms, and this allows you to produce a unique organism through sexual reproduction. So the first organisms that we will talk about are fungi. And fungi can be single-celled or multicellular. If they're multicellular, they are not microscopic, but the single-celled form are microscopic. A very famous form of fungi that everybody knows is a mushroom. And so we know them because we eat them. The study of fungi is called mycology, and it is under the header of microbiology. So fungi are very similar to animals in that they have to take in organic compounds both for energy and for their carbon source. So they are chemoheterotrophs. They don't have a mouth, so they don't ingest food the same way. They absorb food through structures called mycelium. The fungal cell wall contains a protective structure, a protective carbohydrate structure called chitin. Chitin is also what makes the exoskeleton of your arthropods, and the exoskeleton is a very hard outer structure that protects insects and spiders and mites. Fungi also have a molecule similar to cholesterol, but it's known as ergosterol. So it's their form of the cholesterol in the plasma membrane that helps to stabilize and strengthen that plasma membrane. Fungi are decomposers. So they will attach to, they can attach to living or dead tissues, materials. Anything that has organic molecules in it, they'll attach. They tend to like terrestrial environments, but they also need moisture. So a moist terrestrial environment is their ultimate habitat. And once they find that, they then will start to grow. And when they grow, they produce these little tiny structures known as hyphae. The hyphae will then move into or towards the carbohydrate, and that's how they get their food. So saprophytic fungi are fungi that grow on dead or decaying materials. These are the fungi that are super awesome with decomposition, living in forests, getting rid of waste products. But we also have some parasitic fungi that live on living tissue, and their hyphae go into the living tissue. And then we have other fungi that form mutualistic symbiotic relationships with other organisms. And so a lichen is a symbiotic relationship between fungi and algae. There are thousands of species of fungi. We don't know all of them. We are already identified close to 80,000 species, but it is estimated that there could be close to more like 100, or not 100,000, 1,000,000 species of fungi out there. They just haven't been identified. The two major groups that we tend to look at, so these are four of the most important groups of fungi. The two that I have outlined here, Ascomycetes is a really important group because these are the organisms that produce the Saccharomyces, which is the Saccharomyces cerevisiae is what we use in producing alcohols, producing breads, and then penicillium is what we use to produce penicillin. Basidiomycetes, these are the most common fungi that people know because they produce the mushrooms that people eat all the time. But other fungi are still very important. It's just these two groups we tend to come in contact with a lot. And then we have some fungi that are very dangerous as well. So fungi are multicellular, or I should say most fungi are multicellular. The yeasts are unicellular fungi, and Saccharomyces cerevisiae is a yeast, so that's a unicellular organism. Multicellular fungi contain structures called hyphae. The hyphae grow out and towards a food source, and when you have a mass of hyphae together, that's known as the mycelium. And the more mycelium that are produced, the more food or nutrients that can be absorbed by the fungi. So fungi live typically in a moist terrestrial environment. They can't live in water. They don't do well directly in water, but they can grow very well in an environment that has a lot of water in it. Some fungi are parasitic. Their hyphae that they produce are specialized to move into living tissue, and those hyphae tend to be protected from our cells' response to the material moving in. And then we have saprophytic fungi that have anchoring hyphae for the dead and decaying materials. Fungi can be dimorphic, which means they can be found in more than one form, so they can be found as yeasts or as multicellular mycelium. Not all fungi are dimorphic. An example of a fungal species that is dimorphic is Histoplasma capsulatum, which is found in soils and can cause histoplasmosis if breathed in. So some important relationships that fungi can form. Fungi can form lichens, which is a mutualistic symbiosis between fungi and cyanobacteria or algae. And what happens is the cyanobacteria gets protection from the fungi, and the fungi gets food from the cyanobacteria or from the algae. Mycorrhizas are special associations, mutualistic symbioses between plants and fungi. So the fungi grow directly in to the plant roots, and then they give nutrients. As the hyphae suck in nutrients, the plants gain nutrients as well. And then we have fungal gardens. These are kind of cool. So ants are a really cool type of animal. And they live in colonies, and they all have their jobs, and they're very efficient at doing their jobs. Everybody does what they're supposed to do. And some ants are called leafcutter ants, and so their job is to go out and find leaves that they can't eat, but they can give it to fungi, and the fungi can degrade the plants and then produce a byproduct that is usable by the ants. And so the fungi give the ants, or the ants give the fungi plants to eat, and then they go out and they take the resources that the fungi have produced, and then they can feed their offspring. It's really wild. So basically, this is a little garden that the ants have their own fungi, and then they feed their fungi. It's very interesting. And here's an example of a lichen. So lichens can grow in regions where photosynthetic organisms and fungi can't typically grow, but because they're together, they're able to grow in these unique environments, like on the side of a tree in a dry area. So fungi have some really important, or are very important economically. That's what I want to say. Fungi produced some of the first medicines that really helped us get rid of bacterial infections. So penicillin is an example. They also are used in producing different medicines. They're used in producing food as well as beers and wines. Fungi can also grow at temperatures as low as about 5 degrees Celsius, which is what our refrigerators typically are set at. And so they can cause a lot of food spoilage. The majority of the food in your fridge that goes bad is due to fungi. And then fungi actually has caused millions of dollars in damage to crops and trees. One example is potato blight. Potato blight fungi. It's actually a water mold, I believe, which is slightly different from fungi, but it falls under the fungal category. What this did was it wiped out the potatoes, the majority of the potatoes in Ireland in the 1840s, and this blight ended up causing close to, or maybe slightly over, 1 million people that lived in Ireland to die of starvation. And then we had millions more flee from Ireland to get away from the blight. And so this was a really, really big problem. And the worst part was England wasn't really helping out that much. They just kind of didn't do a lot. So it really caused a lot of problems to Ireland, and it's probably one of the major reasons why Ireland kind of fought for their own independence. There, sorry. Going around looking at everything. Wow, that's a bad slide. Let me fix it and then I'll come and talk to you about it. Boom. Now it looks all pretty, right? So we can also look at the medical importance of fungi. So I already mentioned that fungi are important because they help in producing some antibiotics, which are really important to us, but they also can cause problems. Fungi can actually cause human illness either by causing an allergic reaction to the body. They can actually grow on you or in your body, causing diseases like athlete's foot or ringworm or cradle cap. That's another one. And then they can cause problems because of some of the chemicals that they release. So fungal toxins produce a lot of nervous system problems as well as digestive problems. So think about Claviceps purpurea. This fungus actually caused people to hallucinate. They caused severe abdominal pains. And so back in, I can't tell you the dates, but during the Salem witch trials, there were people that actually thought that they were being possessed by like witches because of the fungus that was getting into their rye. And so when they make the rye breads, this fungus would be there and it caused all kinds of problems. The next group of organisms we'll talk about are algae. Algae are photosynthetic eukaryotic organisms. They differ from plants. Sorry. They differ from plants in that algae tend to live in water, not on land. And algae can be unicellular or multicellular. Some of the chemicals that algae gives off can cause some different problems, but algae in a nutshell doesn't actually cause disease to humans at all. So algae are a very unique group, and I'm going to move my face here so you can see this. If you look over here, you can see the different areas where algae falls under. So some algae are closely related to plants. And so here we have the plants, and then we have these red algae and green algae. There are your land plants, and then there's another form of green algae. We have some algae that are up here that are by the water molds, and water molds, like I said before, fall under the fungal category. We have other algae down here that fall under well, no, those aren't like algae, those are, sorry. We have other algae right here that fall in with some of the protozoan organisms. So algae are not a tight-knit group. They're very unique. Each species are unique because they have different characteristics that make them unique, and so it's hard to put them into a category, which is why they are so spread out. And we don't like this, but we're constantly reclassifying algae. And algae tend to fall into a lot of different groups, just like protozoans do when I get to them. For a while, algae and protozoans were together, actually. So algae are important because some of the byproducts that algae produce, we use. They are similar to plants in that they have a cell wall composed of cellulose, just like plants do, and they do undergo photosynthesis. Not all plants or not all algae use the same pigment molecules. Hold on a second. Yes. So sorry about that. So we typically classify them based on their ribosomal RNA, and that's how we have been putting the different algae in groups. Algae, some algae have flagella, which allows them to move through water, and some algae grow in groupings, so they're unicellular, but they grow in groups, kind of like colonies. So like dinoflagellates do this. And so you can see them here. And then we have some algae that are macroscopic, and there's a man standing in a river of algae. Algae that are macroscopic can be either brown, green, or red algae. And they have a special stalk that contains a holdfast on it to hold the algae in place. And then they have leaf-like structures as well. So these blades are the leaf-like structures. Here's the stalk, and there's that holdfast I was talking about. Algae the leaf-like structures on the algae are where photosynthesis occurs. Algae tend to live they always live in very wet environments in general, either fresh or salt waters. Some algae can grow on very moist soils, but in general, just assume they're going to be found in waters. Algae are the biggest producers of oxygen. So without algae, we would die. And they take in a lot of our carbon dioxide, so they help to combat global warming. Different algae live at different depths. And the different depths allow them to take in sunlight at different levels, so different rays. And so because of this, they have different pigments. Planktonic algae are algae that float near the surface. They are unicellular, and a lot of them don't have the ability to move. They use little gas vacuoles to move up and down, but that's about it. Planktonic algae also form the base of the food chain in water. And so here's my little joke there. Be honest, Dad. As a plankton, where are we on the food chain? Here at the bottom. But who wants to say that, right? Algae tend to reproduce asexually through mitosis and fragmentation. But they can produce or reproduce sexually as well. Some algae can. And algae can grow as haploid or as diploid organisms. So algae themselves don't cause a lot of problems. They are used actually in foods that we eat. Think of seaweed. People wrap rice with seaweed. Most of the raw fish that people eat, sushi, is wrapped in seaweed. But some algae, when the nutrients are really high in the water and the environment is warmer, they will produce a lot of chemicals or toxins as byproducts. And so what these byproducts do is they can sit inside of a lot of our shellfish. So as shellfish take in water, they get those toxins inside of them. It doesn't really do anything to the shellfish, but if we eat those same shellfish, that poison can get into us, and that can cause paralytic shellfish poisoning. I'm going to stop here and I'll start recording probably when I get home tonight for the rest of this chapter, okay? So we just have protozoans, and from the protozoans we'll get into the worms, which are super fun, and our insects. Have a great afternoon, and I will see you in class.